So here's the background in a nutshell for this project bike. The guy I bought it from was riding it on the highway and it died and close to do a stop. He was able to get it started again, but it kept tripping and dying the entire way home. It was just acting really wonky. So he took it to the dealership after that and they did their run through and diagnostic stuff, whatever that involves, and said, dude, you got serious issues going on in here. It'd be more cost efficient if we just replaced the entire engine for you. Previous owner was like, no thanks, not really feeling that. So he actually ended up getting a new bike and selling this one, and that's how it fell into my hands. So everything I just said is essentially all I know about this bike. This video is going to be me just kind of running through my approach of how I tried to sniff out the problem, my diagnostic approach, and how I eventually found and fixed the issue. I should say, as a disclaimer, I 90% of the time, especially with these kind of bikes, have no idea what I'm doing. So don't take my word for anything I say.
The first thing was to see if the bike would even start and run. Since it had been sitting for so long, the battery is completely dead, so I just borrowed the battery from my good bike. The dealer who inspected the bike drained the oil as part of their diagnostic procedure, I guess, so I was sure to just fill that up again before giving it a crank. My initial thought was that the bike was experiencing some kind of fuel delivery issue, or that maybe even it wasn't firing on one of the cylinders. So I pulled the spark plugs first to give them a check, and they both looked pretty even in color, with neither of them being overly wet, which would have indicated that it wasn't firing and combusting the fuel in its chamber. At this point, my plan was to slowly work my way down to the fuel injectors, since I still thought quite surely that it was a fuel delivery issue. So I thought maybe there's a little debris in the fuel injector, something was going on there. On the way, I pulled the air filter, of course, to give that a check. A little bit of debris, definitely nothing bad, at least not bad enough to make the engine struggle as much as it was. One of the tricky things about working on these big street bikes is the wiring harnesses just go all over the place. They're a spaghetti mess every time, and I kind of hate to admit it, but when I put them back together, they rarely go back together exactly the way they were when I took them apart. But my mindset is, as long as the wires end up where they're supposed to end up, then it works. Eventually I made it down to the fuel injectors and tested them out. I really just wanted to make sure that they were misting out a good volume of fuel and somewhat functioning, which these ones were. At this point, I'm feeling a little bit baffled. I have proved that the fuel system is properly pressurizing, the fuel pump is fully operational, the injectors are injecting fuel directly into the cylinders, and the spark plugs are correctly firing. I was admittedly surprised because really I thought the symptoms pointed directly to fuel delivery, but now that's ruled out. After some stewing and a little bit of research, I developed another hunch and decided to check the engine timing. To do that, you start by lining up this notch on the stator cover with one of the notches engraved on the flywheel. This indicates that one of the two pistons is at top dead center, so at the very top of its stroke. Then you go up to the top end of the engine and remove this cover that covers the cam sprocket. Now, because I lined up the crankshaft so that cylinder 1 is at top dead center, this cam sprocket should share the same reading, meaning that the mark here on the engine case should line up perfectly with one of these two marks on the cam sprocket, which I know it's hard to tell with this angle because it's kind of off center, but it definitely does not. It is slightly off, and that is just enough to prove to me that the engine is out of time. Now I'm changing gears and jumping into the engine to investigate this timing issue. I was admittedly very curious because normally if an engine goes out of time, it completely goes out of time, meaning one of the sprockets gets stripped or the chain breaks, which would lead to catastrophic failure, where in this case the engine still kind of ran, which was kind of odd to me. As soon as I got the valve cover off, I noticed this issue. This is the top of the cam chain tensioner, and as you can tell, that little rivet pin is almost completely fallen out and binding up. So at that point I knew it's time to rip into the clutch side of things so I can pull out that tensioner and see the full story. You know those kinds of mistakes that you make over and over and over again, but you never really change your action and avoid doing it the next time? For me, the perfect example of this is leaving an oil pan full of oil underneath the engine while you're pulling off very small and delicate parts. Soon enough, I made my way down to the tensioner, which is attached with a bolt on the bottom right by the crankshaft, and there's a couple up top on top of the engine cylinder there. After I undid those, it was just a matter of shimmying it up through the top. Once it was out, I confirmed that yes, that pin at the top was totally loose, out of place. In fact, it fell out with just a little bit of encouragement. The other crazy thing I noticed after looking at some part drawings was there is an entire spring missing on the tensioner assembly. Eventually I found it by fishing it out of the oil sump using a magnet, and I'm amazed and grateful, I should mention, that when the spring came undone, that it worked its way past all of the gears that could have ground it to bits, and it just went down in this teeny hole into the oil sump. Clearly I had found my issue. The spring on the cam chain tensioner failed, broke off, relieving the tension on the cam chain, causing it to jump just one sprocket tooth and go out of time. I was very excited to find a used cam chain and cam chain tensioner on eBay, and for a lot cheaper than I was expecting, so that was a huge plus. Looking at this new tensioner on the side here, these little guide rails, this is what they're supposed to look like. The old one, the chain, because it was loose, had completely chewed up those same side rails. And then looking at the actual cam chains, you can see that the old one was quite a bit chewed up, so glad to replace that. After installing the new used cam chain and tensioner, I decided to do just a quick valve adjustment, since the bike was due for a valve adjustment anyway at that number of miles. While putting things back together, I, for the first time in my life, made a gasket from scratch. This was for the clutch cover gasket, and although I had some hiccups, I was overall pretty pleased with the result. It's time to refill the oil in the crankcase, put some lemonade in the radiator, and give it a start. The bike ran beautifully. At that point, it was just time to put all the bodywork back together, stuff all the loose wires wherever they would fit, and call it a day.
I had a lot of fun with this project bike, and I'm glad it had a positive outcome in the end. Needless to say, I will be selling it in the near future. I definitely don't have a need for 2 identical street bikes. So we'll see what rolls through the garage next time for the next project. Thanks for watching.